Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be doing a deep dive into Canada's new immigration plan. It's been causing quite a stir. We've got some excerpts from speeches by the Prime Minister and the Immigration Minister. And let me tell you, it's a lot to take in. Canada's known for being so welcoming to new folks, but it looks like they're shaking things up. Big time.
Yeah, it is pretty interesting. They really take pride in their immigration system, but even they're admitting there are some problems. The prime minister even talked about things like labor shortages and just the strain on social services. But then he also mentioned making sure things are fair for the people who already live there. That's a tough line to walk.
For sure it is. And that's what makes this so interesting, right? It's not just about the numbers. It's about all these different viewpoints and priorities. So, okay, let's dive into the plan itself. What's the overall picture here?
Well, the biggest thing that jumps out is they're actually reducing immigration targets over the next 3 years. They're aiming to just pause population growth, which is a pretty big deal.
Well, hold on. A pause on population growth. You don't hear that every day. What's the reasoning there?
Seems like they want to hit the pause button and give their infrastructure and services a chance to catch up, like maybe taking a breather before a marathon. Could really help ease the pressure on things like housing and healthcare. Those have been really hot topics.
Especially housing. The plan even says that this reduction in immigration could shrink the housing supply gap by something like 670,000 units by 2027. That's a massive potential impact.
Yeah, when you think about how connected immigration and housing demand are, it makes sense. Less people coming in means less demand, and that could theoretically help with affordability, though it'll be interesting to see how it plays out in different housing markets.
Absolutely. And get this plan isn't just about permanent residents. It's looking at temporary workers and international students too.
Right, that's a crucial point. Temporary residents actually make up a huge part of Canada's population growth, so managing that is super important.
Wow, over 50% of temporary residents are international students and people on post-grad work permits. That's a crazy number. What's that going to mean for universities and all the industries that depend on those temporary workers?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it? Some universities might need to rethink how many students they can take, and some industries might find themselves short on workers if they can't get those temporary workers as easily.
And it seems like the government is expecting some pushback.
Yeah.
The prime minister was really direct when he criticized corporations for taking advantage of foreign workers, and he even called out universities for just trying to make money off of it. Those are some pretty serious accusations.
It definitely shows the ethical challenges with temporary worker programs. The idea is to fill in gaps, but there's always that risk of exploitation if workers aren't protected.
Mhm.
And, sometimes companies put profits ahead of people.
No doubt about it.
Mhm.
And then on top of everything else, the plan wants to increase French-speaking immigration outside of Quebec. Why is that such a big focus?
Goes back to Canada's dedication to being bilingual. Supporting Francophone communities all over the country is really important to their national identity. But getting French speakers to settle outside of Quebec has always been tricky.
So I got to ask, how are they going to actually do that? Will it affect the language requirements for a certain immigration stream?
That's something to watch, for sure. They might set up special immigration streams for French speakers or offer them incentives to settle in specific areas.
Okay, interesting. Now let's talk about something that's really important to a lot of people, regularization. This means giving legal status to undocumented immigrants. But it seems like the hopes for a big mass program are gone.
Yeah, mass regularization is a very, very complicated thing. There are so many logistics to figure out, and it can be politically divisive. And there is even the question of how the public might see it. Really tough to handle.
Yeah, the minister did say they're looking at a smaller program focused on specific areas like construction and healthcare. So it's not totally off the table.
Right. A targeted approach like that could help with worker shortages in those industries, while still being easier to manage than a huge program.
Okay, so we've covered the main points of this new plan. It's definitely ambitious and has a lot of different angles. But what does this all mean for Canada moving forward?
The big question is, will the government be able to balance everything they want to do? Can they deal with the concerns about housing, social services, and exploitation of workers, while still keeping Canada's reputation as a welcoming and diverse country?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And it's one we'll keep digging into as we go deeper into this plan. Stick with us. Things are going to get even more interesting as we unpack the potential consequences and ripple effects of all these changes. It's really interesting, right? As we look at this plan, there's this tension underneath it all. On the one hand, they want to be welcoming and inclusive. But on the other hand, they're definitely trying to deal with some of the worries people have about how immigration affects things like housing and jobs. It's a real balancing act.
Oh, it is. And it's something so many countries are struggling with right now. How do you stay open while managing the real pressures that come with more people? No easy solutions there.
No kidding. One of the things that stood out to me was the Prime Minister's comment about corporations exploiting foreign workers. He was pretty straight up about it.
Mm.
Is that a big worry in Canada?
It's definitely something people are worried about. In a lot of places with these temporary worker programs, the idea is to fill gaps in the workforce. But there's always the chance of exploitation if those workers aren't protected. And let's be honest, sometimes companies just care more about profits than people.
Right. And then there's the criticism about universities bringing in more international students than places can handle. Is that a fair point?
There definitely needs to be better planning for sure. If there are more students than housing or services, it puts pressure on everyone. It's not just the students themselves, it's about the impact on the whole community.
That makes sense. So it seems like this plan is trying to deal with some of those issues. But here's something I've been wondering. Could these cuts to immigration actually hurt the Canadian economy? They've depended on immigration for growth for a long time.
It's a risk, no doubt. The government's basically betting that this pause will give them time to adjust and build up capacity. But there's also a chance that slowing immigration will lead to worker shortages in important industries. It's a delicate balance.
For sure. Let's go back to that focus on bringing in French speakers outside of Quebec. How are they going to make that happen?
Well, they have a few options. They could create specific immigration categories with language rules just for French speakers, or they could offer incentives, like financial help or faster processing. For French speakers who choose to live in certain areas, it'll be interesting to see what they focus on.
And what about the decision to not go with mass regularization? That must be really disappointing for undocumented immigrants who are hoping to become citizens.
It's such a complicated issue, with no easy solutions. A mass regularization program can be a logistical nightmare to set up. And politically, it can be very divisive. It seems like they're going with a more targeted approach for now. But the pressure to deal with the situation more broadly will probably keep going.
One thing that caught my eye was the emphasis on helping temporary residents become permanent residents.
Yeah.
It sounds like they're seeing the value of people who are already in Canada, contributing to the economy and society.
Exactly. These are people who are already integrated, they have experience working, and they're used to Canadian culture. It makes a lot of sense to help them stay permanently.
But the details are where it gets tricky, right? How will they decide who gets to transition and who doesn't?
That's where the tough choices come in. They'll probably have to come up with some criteria that prioritize certain skills or industries or education levels, and it's really important that those rules are clear and seem fair.
You know, we've been talking about the practical stuff, but I keep coming back to the human impact. These changes are going to have a huge effect on people's lives, their dreams, their families.
It's so important to remember that every policy decision affects people. And for a lot of people, immigration, it's about more than just the economy. It's about finding a better life, getting away from hardship, or being with loved ones. It's about hope and opportunity.
That's right. And talking about impact, what about Canada's image in the world? They've built a reputation for being welcoming and diverse. Could these changes affect how people see them?
It's a valid worry for sure. How they put these changes into practice and talk about them will be really important. They need to find that sweet spot between managing immigration and keeping their image as a place that welcomes people.
Okay, so we've explored the big picture, the possible consequences, and the human side of things. But now I'm wondering, how will this actually work in real life? What will it look like for individuals and communities?
That's a great question, and it takes us to the next level of this whole thing. We need to unpack the specifics. How will the selection process for different immigration categories work? What concrete steps will they take to stop exploitation of temporary workers? How will they make sure everyone has fair access to housing and services?
Right, we've talked about the what, but now it's time to dig into the how. That's where things get real. We'll look at those details and potential scenarios right after this. All right, so let's get down to the nitty-gritty here. We've talked about the big picture, but how's this actually going to work on the ground?
Well, one of the key things to watch is going to be those selection criteria for different immigration streams. We talked about prioritizing temporary residents for permanent residency, but how are they actually going to decide who gets to stay and who doesn't? What are they going to look at? Work experience, education level, language skills, ties to the community, maybe a mix of everything.
Sounds like a pretty complex puzzle to solve. Trying to be fair and transparent all at the same time.
Exactly. And then there's the whole question of enforcement. The prime minister was pretty clear about cracking down on those corporations exploiting foreign workers. But how are they actually going to make sure that happens? Stricter rules, more inspections, tougher penalties for companies that break the rules. That's what will determine if this plan actually has any teeth.
Right. And what about those concerns with universities and all the international students? Are they going to limit how many students they can take? Or will they work with local governments to get more housing and support services? There's a lot going on here.
Absolutely. It's not just about setting targets and making announcements. It's about those nitty-gritty details of making it happen and actually following through. The real test is going to be whether they can turn these big ideas into concrete actions that actually make a difference in people's lives.
Yeah, it's easy to get caught up in the numbers and the big ideas when we talk about policy. But we got to remember that this is about real people.
You said it. Behind every statistic, every policy, there's a human story. For some people, this plan is going to be full of hope, a chance for a new start, a path to stability, an opportunity to build a good life. But for others, it might mean disappointment or uncertainty or even having to move again. It's important to keep that human side in mind as we see how this all unfolds.
Definitely. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I keep coming back to the same question. Can Canada really pull this off? Can they find that balance between managing immigration and still being seen as a welcoming country?
I guess we'll have to wait and see. But one thing's for sure. This new plan is a big change in how Canada is approaching immigration. It's a bold move with big consequences, and it's going to be really interesting to watch how it all plays out.
Well, that's what we're here for. Here at the Deep Dive, we take these complicated issues, break them down, and give you the info you need to understand this crazy world. So keep those questions coming, stay curious, and we'll see you on the next Deep Dive.